me the killing blow you learned in the Holy Land, Father," he says, his eyes bright with excitement. "I want to be a great warrior like you." The innocence in his voice is devastating. How do you explain that the killing blow you learned was often delivered to men who were already wounded and helpless? How do you tell your son that great warriors spend their nights haunted by the faces of those they've killed? How do you preserve his admiration while warning him about the cost of the path he wants to follow? You begin his training, but you find yourself teaching defensive techniques, emphasizing protection rather than aggression. When he asks why you don't demonstrate the attacking combinations he's heard about from other knights, you deflect with technical explanations about the importance of foundation skills. But the truth is that picking up a sword, even for training, brings back muscle memories of real combat that make your hands shake and your vision blur. Eleanor notices your reluctance to discuss your experiences, and in her loving concern, she arranges for Father Benedict to visit a holy man known for his wisdom and discretion. She hopes that speaking to a priest about your experiences in the Holy Land might bring you spiritual comfort and help you process whatever troubles your soul. It's a reasonable expectation. After all, you fought in God's name and surely a man of God can help you understand how your service fits into divine plan. But when Father Benedict sits across from you in your private solar, eager to hear tales of divine providence and righteous victory, you find yourself facing an impossible choice. Do you tell him the truth about what you witnessed? Do you describe how Christian knights raped Muslim women while singing hymns? Do you explain how you watched fellow believers torture prisoners for information that could save Christian lives? Do you share your growing suspicion that God was either absent from the Holy Land or equally present on both sides of the conflict? Instead, you offer sanitized accounts that preserve both his faith and your reputation. You speak of hardships overcome through prayer, of divine intervention in moments of crisis, of the joy of liberating sacred sites. The words feel like poison in your mouth, but they're what he needs to hear and what your position requires you to say. When he leaves, blessing you for your faithful service, you feel more isolated than before. Even God's representative can't be trusted with the truth of what serving God actually required. The isolation deepens when you encounter other returned crusaders at regional gatherings. Lord Henry, who fought beside you at the siege of Jerusalem, greets you with boisterous enthusiasm and immediately begins recounting tales of glory and triumph. His version of events bears little resemblance to your memories, but his audience of local nobles hangs on every word. Either his mind has transformed the experiences into something bearable, or he's consciously choosing to perpetuate myths that make the reality irrelevant. Sir Malcolm, another veteran, takes you aside during one such gathering for a moment. You hope to find someone who shares your struggles, someone who understands the gap between expectation and reality. But when you tentatively mention the difficulties of readjustment, he responds with aggressive cheerfulness, the glory of serving. Christ makes any hardship worthwhile. We must thank God for choosing us to be his instruments of justice. His vehemence suggests he's trying to convince himself as much as you, but it also makes clear that honest discussion isn't welcome even among those who share the experience. You begin to understand that you're not just isolated by your experiences. You're isolated by your inability to transform those experiences into acceptable narratives. Other returned crusaders have either genuinely integrated their service into their existing worldview or learned to present public versions that satisfy social expectations. Your inability to do either marks you as somehow deficient, weak, or lacking in proper faith. The realization that you might be permanently changed, permanently damaged by your service, brings a new kind of terror. If you can't return to who you were and you can't become who you're expected to be, what's left? The man who could lead with confidence is gone. The man who could love without reservation is gone. The man who could sleep peacefully is gone. In their place stands someone you don't recognize, someone who flinches at unexpected sounds, who sees threats in innocent gatherings, who can't touch his wife without remembering the texture of blood on his hands, the erosion of faith crisis. A faith begins not with grand theological doubts, but with small, persistent questions that gnaw at the foundations of everything you once believed. In the Holy Land, you witnessed events that your Christian upbringing had no framework to explain. Now, back home, sitting through familiar church services and listening to sermons about God's justice and love, You find yourself mentally comparing the priest's words to your memories of what was done in God's name. Father Benedict delivers a passionate sermon about the righteous war against the infidel, praising the crusaders who fought to reclaim sacred ground for Christendom. His words are meant to honor your service, but they feel like accusations. He speaks of God's will being manifest through Christian victory, but you remember Muslim physicians treating Christian wounded with more compassion than Christian knights showed to Muslim prisoners. He describes the enemy as instruments of evil, but you recall conversations with captured scholars whose understanding of Scripture rivaled that. Any Christian theologian during the consecration of the Eucharist as you kneel before the altar. That has been central to your spiritual life since childhood. You find yourself remembering the mosque in Damascus where you sought shelter during a sandstorm. The beauty of that sacred space, the devotion of the worshippers, the sense of divine presence you felt there. How does that experience fit with everything you've been taught about the exclusive nature of Christian truth? The questions multiply. During sleepless nights, if God ordained the crusade, why did it require so much evil? If Christians are God's chosen people, why did they behave worse than those they called pagans? If faith in Christ guarantees salvation, why did good Christian men die in agony while their enemies sometimes showed them mercy? The circular logic that once satisfied your spiritual needs, God's ways are mysterious. Faith transcends understanding. Divine justice operates beyond human comprehension, now feels like evasion, rather than wisdom. Eleanor notices your distraction during prayers and assumes your spiritual struggles, the temporary effects of the hardships you endured. She suggests increased devotion as a remedy, more prayer, more fasting, for charitable works to honor God for your safe return. Her prescriptions, well-intentioned and theologically sound, but they require a level of faith you no longer possess. How do you explain that prayer now feels like addressing an absent deity? That fasting seems meaningless after watching children starve while armies fight over holy sites. The annual celebration of the Feast of the Holy Cross commemorating the discovery of Christ's crucifixion site becomes a particular torment. The entire community gathers to honor the sacred relic and praise God for revealing His truth. Through the Crusades, you're expected to participate prominently given your status as a veteran of the Holy Land campaigns, but standing before the wooden cross listening to accounts of its miraculous discovery. You remember the dozens of true cross fragments you saw being sold by opportunistic merchants in Jerusalem markets during the service. Young boys in the congregation look at you with admiration, seeing in your presence confirmation of everything they've been taught about Christian valor and divine favor. Their innocent faith serves as a mirror, reflecting how much your own beliefs have changed. You remember being their age, hearing similar stories about previous crusades, feeling the same excitement about serving God through martial valor. The continuity of these myths, their power to inspire new generations to repeat the same cycles of violence and disillusionment, fills you with something approaching despair. Private confession with Father Benedict becomes increasingly difficult. The sacrament requires honesty about your sins, but the worst sins you witnessed were committed by those claiming divine authority. How do you confess doubt when that doubt is based on direct observation of religious hypocrisy? How do you seek absolution for losing faith when that faith was shattered by the actions of fellow believers? You begin offering vague confessions about spiritual struggles and requests for prayers to strengthen your devotion. Father Benedict interprets these as normal readjustment difficulties and offers standard spiritual counsel about trusting in God's plan and finding peace through submission to divine will. His advice isn't wrong, but it's based on assumptions about your experience that you can't correct, without undermining his faith as well as your reputation. The theological crisis deepens when you attempt to read Scripture with the same devotion you once brought to holy texts. Passages about righteous war and divine vengeance that once inspired your martial service now seem to justify any violence committed by those claiming godly purpose. Stories of chosen people overcoming their enemies no longer feel like encouragement. They feel like warnings about the dangers of believing you understand God's will. You find yourself drawn instead to passages about suffering, doubt, and abandonment. The Psalms of Lament speak to your experience in ways that triumphant hymns no longer can. Christ's cry from the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" resonates. The feelings you can't express in any other context. But even this comfort is complicated by the knowledge that similar words of anguish were probably spoken by the enemies you killed, men who believed they were serving God just as fervently as you did. The erosion of faith wouldn't be complete without the loss of your previously unquestioned belief in the righteousness of your social position. As a noble knight, you were raised to believe that your authority came from God, that the feudal hierarchy reflected divine order, that your wealth and power were signs of heavenly favor. But in the Holy Land, you witnessed Christian nobles behaving with incredible cruelty while Muslim merchants and artisans demonstrated qualities of justice and mercy that your Christian upbringing claimed were exclusive to believers. The comfortable certainties that once justified your privileged position, that nobility carried moral obligations, that power should serve justice, that social hierarchy reflected spiritual truth, now seem like convenient myths designed to legitimize exploitation. When you sit in judgment over your tenants' disputes, you're increasingly aware that your authority rests on force rather than wisdom, tradition rather than divine mandate. This loss of faith in social structures parallels your loss of religious faith, creating a comprehensive worldview collapse that affects every aspect of daily life. The rituals that once provided comfort now feel empty. The relationships that once seemed natural now seem artificial. Responsibilities that once felt meaningful now seem arbitrary. You're left not just with traumatic memories of war, but the complete dissolution of the framework that previously gave your life meaning and purpose. The phantom sensations of war 3 months after your return. Your body still carries the war in ways that have nothing to do with visible scars. Every morning brings the phantom weight of armor you're no longer wearing. Your shoulders ache from mail that isn't there. Your sword arm twitches for a weapon you're not carrying. And your neck strains against a helm that exists only in muscle memory. The physical habits of constant warfare don't disappear simply because the fighting has ended. Walking through your own castle requires conscious effort to move normally. In the Holy Land, every step was calculated, checking for stable footing, maintaining formation, staying alert for ambush. 3 years of such movement has rewired your nervous system, and now even familiar corridors feel like potential battlefields. You catch yourself moving along walls, avoiding open spaces, positioning yourself where you can see exits. Eleanor notices but doesn't comment, adding this to her growing catalog of changes in the man who returned wearing her husband's name. Sleep remains the most treacherous territory. Your bedchamber, once a sanctuary of rest and intimacy, has become a nightly battleground between exhaustion and hypervigilance. The soft mattress feels wrong after years of sleeping on hard ground with one ear alert for danger. The silence of the castle at night, which should be peaceful, feels ominous, like the unnatural quiet that sometimes preceded dawn attacks your nervous system. Trained to interpret stillness as potential threat, won't allow complete relaxation. Even in perfect safety, when sleep finally comes, it brings visitors you didn't invite. Sir Marcus appears regularly, looking exactly as he did in the moment before the crossbow bolt took him in the throat. During the siege of Acre, he doesn't speak. The dead rarely do in your dreams, but his presence fills you with the specific guilt of survival. Why did he die while you lived? What made your life more valuable than his? These questions have no answers, but your sleeping mind insists on asking them repeatedly. The dreams aren't always about death. Sometimes they're worse. They're about the moments when you chose violence over mercy, necessity over honor, survival over morality. You relive the decision to execute prisoners who couldn't be fed or guarded, the choice to burn supplies rather than let them fall into enemy hands, knowing civilians would starve. These were rational military decisions, justified by circumstances and endorsed by your superiors. But rational justification doesn't silence the voices of conscience that speak loudest in dreams. Your relationship with food has changed in ways that puzzle and worry Eleanor. Meals were scarce and precious in the Holy Land, never taken for granted, often shared among men who might be dead before the next feeding. Now, confronted with the abundance of your own table, you feel guilt rather than pleasure. How can you enjoy rich foods knowing that others are starving? How can you complain about any dish when you remember the taste of leather boiled for sustenance? During the siege of Ascalon, you find yourself hoarding food, unconsciously hiding bread in your chamber, storing dried meat in your saddlebags, keeping water containers closer than necessary. Eleanor discovers these caches and gently asks about them. But you can't explain the compulsion without admitting how precarious survival felt. How quickly abundance could become scarcity, how a siege could turn any fortress into a tomb. Sounds, trigger responses that make no sense in peaceful contexts. The clash of metal from the blacksmith's forge sends you diving for cover. Before your conscious mind recognizes the source, church bells, once comforting calls to prayer, now sound like alarm signals, the laughter of children playing war games. In the courtyard brings flashbacks so vivid you have to excuse yourself from conversations and seek privacy until your hands stop shaking. Music, particularly martial songs that once stirred your pride, now brings nausea. The heroic ballads sung by traveling minstrels about crusader victories sound like mockeries of the reality you witnessed. When a visiting bard performs a song about the glorious capture of Jerusalem, praising the righteous slaughter of infidels, you have to leave the hall. The other nobles assume you're being modest about your role in the victory. Only you know you're fleeing from the memory of streets flowing with blood from Christian swords wielded against Muslim civilians. Physical intimacy with Eleanor becomes another casualty of your altered neurology. Touch that once brought comfort now often triggers defensive reflexes. Your body, trained to interpret unexpected contact as potential attack, responds to her gentle caresses with tension and vigilance. She approaches with patience and understanding, but you can see the hurt in her eyes when your body pulls away from hers. Before your mind can intervene, the worst moments come when your war trained reflexes activate in civilian contexts during a friendly wrestling match with your son. Muscle memory kicks in and you find yourself applying a killing hold. Before conscious thought stops you in a crowded market, someone bumps into you unexpectedly and you spin with raised fists before recognizing the innocent merchant who simply lost his balance. These incidents terrify you more than external dangers, because they suggest you might be losing control of the very instincts that kept you alive. Your hands, once steady enough for delicate work like reading illuminated manuscripts or carving wooden toys, for your children now shake unpredictably. The tremor isn't constant, but it comes without warning, usually when you're trying to perform tasks that require fine motor control. You drop things, spill wine, fumble with simple mechanisms. The physical competence that was crucial to your identity as a warrior has been replaced by an unreliable body that betrays you in peaceful moments. Weather affects you differently now. Storms that once seemed merely inconvenient now feel threatening. The sound of wind reminds you of arrows in flight. Rain on windows sounds like approaching cavalry, and thunder brings back the crash of siege engines against city walls. You find yourself checking defenses during bad weather, ensuring windows are secured and weapons are accessible, preparing for attacks that exist only in traumatic memory. Most disturbing is the way your senses have been permanently altered by trauma. You see threats that aren't there, shadows that might be assassins, movements that might be ambushes, gestures that might be attacks. Your hearing has become hyperacute to certain frequencies, the whisper of steel being drawn, the creak of bowstrings being pulled, the specific footfall pattern of men moving information while becoming strangely deaf to normal conversation and peaceful sounds. The fractured household you return has altered not just your own life, but the delicate ecosystem of relationships that sustain a medieval household. Every person who depends on you, from your wife and children to your servants and tenants, must adapt to the reality that their lord has returned fundamentally changed. The adjustments ripple through every aspect of daily life, creating tensions and sorrows that no one fully understands and no one can openly discuss. Eleanor bears the heaviest burden of adaptation. The man she married was confident, decisive, affectionate, someone who made her feel safe and cherished. The man who returned is withdrawn, unpredictable, often absent even when physically present. She tries to understand, tries to give you space while also providing support, but the effort exhausts her. You catch her sometimes staring at you with an expression of profound sadness, mourning not just the changes in you but the marriage that was lost to war. Her attempts to help often backfire, because they're based on understanding the old you rather than the new reality. She organizes gatherings with neighbors, thinking social connection will restore your spirits, but crowds now make you anxious. She plans hunting expeditions, remembering how much you once enjoyed them, but the sport reminds you too much of stalking human prey. She suggests pilgrimages to local shrines, hoping spiritual reflection will bring peace. But religious environments now trigger more doubt than comfort. The children adapt with the resilience typical of youth, but their adaptation is its own form. Tragedy. Margaret learns not to approach too quickly or make sudden movements around you. William stops asking for training sessions when he realizes they upset you. Both children develop an unnatural carefulness around their father, walking softly, speaking quietly, trying to be the children they think you need rather than the children they naturally are. Young William faces the particular challenge of reconciling his heroic image of his father with the withdrawn, troubled man who returned. Still wants to follow in your footsteps, still dreams of martial glory, but he's beginning to sense that the reality might be different from the stories. And other boys his age boast about their father's military exploits. William finds himself defensive and confused, unable to explain why his father, clearly a veteran of great campaigns, never speaks of his achievements. Margaret, too young to understand war but old enough to sense emotional atmospheres, begins exhibiting behaviors that worry Eleanor. As nightmares that wake the household, she becomes clingy and fearful of separation. She asks repeatedly whether you're going away again. The trauma is reproducing itself in miniature in your daughter's developing psyche, creating generational echoes of damage that no one in your time period has vocabulary to describe or tools to address. The household staff navigates an even more complex situation. Your servants depend on your leadership for their livelihood and security, but they must now adjust to serving someone whose behavior has become unpredictable. Old Thomas, who served your father and has known you since childhood, watches with particular concern as you struggle with decisions that once came easily. His loyalty remains absolute, but his worry is visible to everyone. Your squire, young Robert, who accompanied you to the Holy Land, faces unique challenges of reintegration. He shares some of your traumatic memories and understands your struggles in ways that others cannot, but his lower social position prevents him from offering the kind of support that true understanding might provide. He can't counsel his lord, can't admit that he also suffers from similar symptoms, can't seek help for problems that would seem like weakness in someone of his station. The dynamic between you and Robert becomes a painful reminder of how trauma isolates people even from those who share similar experiences. You occasionally catch him staring into distance with an expression you recognize, but social conventions prevent either of you from acknowledging what you both understand. Instead, you maintain the formal relationship that feudal hierarchy requires, each of you suffering privately with experiences that could be bearable if shared. Your relationship with the broader community suffers as your withdrawal from social obligations becomes more noticeable. Local lords who once valued your counsel and friendship find themselves excluded from your confidence. Religious responsibilities that once seemed natural, presiding over festivals, leading community prayers, serving as an example of Christian knighthood, now feel like performances you lack the energy to maintain. The economic management of your estates begins to suffer as your attention turns inward. Decisions that once came naturally now require enormous effort. The complex web of obligations, rights, relationships that sustain feudal administration demands consistent attention from someone capable of balancing competing interests and long-term planning. Your increasing inability to focus on such mundane concerns threatens not just your own prosperity, but the welfare of everyone who depends on your leadership. Eleanor gradually assumes more responsibility for household management, not because you delegate authority to her, but because your withdrawal creates a vacuum that must be filled. She handles correspondence with other estates, manages relationships with suppliers and craftsmen, even makes decisions about tenant disputes when can't summon the energy to hold court. Her competence in these areas grows from necessity, but the additional burden adds to her stress and isolation. The most heartbreaking aspect of your household's adaptation is how everyone learns to accommodate your trauma while pretending it doesn't exist. Conversations are carefully steered away from topics that might trigger disturbing memories. Activities are planned around your limitations without acknowledging what those limitations are. Everyone becomes complicit in maintaining the fiction that you're simply readjusting to peacetime, rather than dealing with fundamental changes in your personality and capabilities. This conspiracy of silence, born from love and loyalty, ultimately deepens your isolation, because no one can openly acknowledge the extent of your suffering. No one can offer appropriate support because the changes in you can't be discussed. They can't be understood or addressed. The very people who care most about your welfare become unwitting participants in perpetuating the emotional distance that trauma has created. Your family adapts. Your household adjusts, your community accommodates, but none of these adaptations address the underlying reality that you've been permanently altered by experiences that exceed your society's capacity for understanding or healing. The love that surrounds you feels increasingly distant, not because it's less genuine, but because it's directed towards someone you no longer are. The fractured household you return has altered not just your own life, but the delicate ecosystem of relationships that sustain a medieval household. Every person who depends on you, from your wife and children to your servants and tenants, must adapt to the reality that their lord has returned fundamentally changed. The adjustments ripple through every aspect of daily life, creating tensions and sorrows that no one fully understands and no one can openly discuss. Eleanor bears the heaviest burden of adaptation. The man she married was confident, decisive, affectionate, someone who made her feel safe and cherished. The man who returned is withdrawn, unpredictable, often absent even when physically present. She tries to understand, tries to give you space while also providing support, but the effort exhausts her. You catch her sometimes staring at you with an expression of profound sadness, mourning not just the changes in you, but the marriage that was lost to war. Her attempts to help often backfire, because they're based on understanding the old you rather than the new reality. She organizes gatherings with neighbors, thinking social connection will restore your spirits, but crowds now make you anxious. She plans hunting expeditions, remembering how much you once enjoyed them, but the sport reminds you too much of stalking human prey. She suggests pilgrimages to local shrines, hoping spiritual reflection will bring peace. But religious environments now trigger more doubt than comfort. The children adapt with the resilience typical of youth, but their adaptation is its own form. Tragedy. Margaret learns not to approach too quickly or make sudden movements around you. William stops asking for training sessions when he realizes they upset you. Both children develop an unnatural carefulness around their father, walking softly, speaking quietly, trying to be the children they think you need rather than the children they naturally are. Young William faces the particular challenge of reconciling his heroic image of his father with the withdrawn, troubled man who returned. Still wants to follow in your footsteps, still dreams of martial glory, but he's beginning to sense that the reality might be different from the stories. And other boys his age boast about their father's military exploits. William finds himself defensive and confused, unable to explain why his father, clearly a veteran of great campaigns, never speaks of his achievements. Margaret, too young to understand war but old enough to sense emotional atmospheres, begins exhibiting behaviors that worry Eleanor. She has nightmares that wake the household. She becomes clingy and fearful of separation. She asks repeatedly whether you're going away again. Your trauma is reproducing itself in miniature in your daughter's developing psyche, creating generational echoes of damage. The brotherhood of broken shields knit all your struggles are endured in solitude. To others, fellow veterans whose experiences parallel your own. Men who understand the weight you carry because they bear similar burdens, but finding them requires navigating the social expectations that demand heroic narratives, of searching for honest acknowledgement of trauma's reality. The brotherhood of those who truly understand exists in the shadows of medieval society, recognized through subtle signals and shared silences. Sir Geoffrey D. Clare provides your first glimpse of this hidden fellowship during a regional gathering while other veterans regale audiences with tales of glory. Geoffrey approaches you privately. His words are carefully chosen, testing whether you're someone who might understand. The dreams are the worst part, aren't they? The way the dead visit when you think you're finally safe. His statement hangs in the air between you, an admission that could be interpreted as weakness or confession. Depending on your response, your relief at finding someone who acknowledges the reality behind the myths is overwhelming. Geoffrey becomes a lifeline to sanity, someone with whom you can speak honestly about the gap between expectation and experience. He tells you about his own struggles, the way crowded gatherings make him sweat, how the sound of children crying reminds him of dying soldiers, why he stopped attending church because the sermons about righteous war feel like mockery. Through Jeffrey, you discover a small network of veterans who've learned to recognize each other. They meet informally, often under the pretense of discussing estate management or trade relationships, but their real purpose is providing space for honest conversation about experiences that can't be shared with anyone else. These men represent different levels of adaptation, some functional despite ongoing struggles, others barely maintaining their social obligations, a few who've withdrawn almost completely from normal life. Brother Marcus, a former knight who entered a monastery, but returning from his second crusade, offers a different model of response to trauma. His choice to abandon worldly responsibilities wasn't driven by religious calling, but by inability to pretend that normal life still made sense. The monastery provides structure and purpose, without requiring him to maintain the fiction of heroic satisfaction. His presence in your informal group serves as both comfort and warning, proof that survival is possible, but also evidence of how complete the break with former life might become. Sir William de Montfort represents the most troubling member of your fellowship. He's adapted by embracing brutality as a permanent way of life, turning the violence that traumatized others into a tool for managing civilian existence. He settles disputes through intimidation, treats his serfs with casual cruelty, and speaks of warfare with an enthusiasm that feels more desperate than genuine. His presence reminds you that trauma can destroy capacity for peace rather than desire for war. The conversations within this group reveal the inadequacy of your society's framework for understanding what you've experienced. There are no words in medieval English for post-traumatic stress, no concept of psychological injury, no recognition that minds can be wounded as surely as bodies. You develop your own vocabulary, talking about battle shadows instead of flashbacks, soul sickness instead of depression, ghost weight instead of survivor guilt. These men become the only audience for stories that can't be told elsewhere. With them, you can describe the siege where you watched Christian forces catapult diseased corpses into a city full of civilians. You can admit to the night you considered desertion, not from cowardice but from inability to participate in atrocities justified by religious purpose. You can confess to the growing suspicion that God was either absent from the Holy Land or present on both sides equally. The group develops its own rituals of mutual support. One member faces particular difficulties, anniversary dates of traumatic events, family crises triggered by their changed behavior, or periods when the memories become overwhelming. The others provide practical assistance, not through dramatic gestures or emotional displays, but through quiet presence and shared understanding that requires no explanation. Jeffrey begins visiting your estate more frequently, ostensibly to discuss mutual defense arrangements, but actually to provide companionship during your worst periods. He recognizes the signs, the way your jaw tightens when conversations turn toward military matters, the subtle flinch when unexpected sounds break the silence, the distant look that means you're seeing something that happened years ago and leagues away. The Brotherhood also serves as an early warning system. When Sir Robert de Vere begins showing signs of complete breakdown, neglecting his estates, abusing his servants, threatening violence against neighbors over minor disputes, the group intervenes, not through confrontation, which might push him over the edge, but through gradual engagement that provides alternatives to destructive behavior. Brother Marcus offers spiritual counsel. Jeffrey provides practical assistance with estate management, and you offer silent companionship during Robert's darkest hours. Through these relationships, you begin to understand that your trauma exists on a spectrum. Some men, like Jeffrey, maintain functional lives while carrying permanent scars. Others, like Brother Marcus, find peace through radical life changes. A few, like William de Montfort, transform their damage into different forms of violence. And some, like Robert de Vere, teeter on the edge of complete dissolution. Your own position on this spectrum isn't fixed. It can improve or deteriorate, depending on circumstances and choices. You're only beginning to recognize the most valuable aspect of this fellowship is the permission it grants for partial recovery. The outside world demands that you either return to your previous self or admit to complete failure. As a knight and Christian, the Brotherhood understands that healing might mean becoming someone new rather than recovering someone lost. They accept that you might never again be the confident leader you once were, while still believing you can be someone worth being. The seasons of gradual healing recovery you discover doesn't follow the linear progression that storytellers prefer. But no dramatic moments of revelation, no sudden returns to wholeness, no miraculous interventions that restore what was lost. Instead, healing comes in small increments, often barely noticeable, frequently followed by setbacks that make progress seem illusory. But gradually, over seasons rather than days, something resembling peace begins to take root in the ruins of your former certainties. First sign of improvement comes through your relationship with your son William. During a particularly difficult winter morning, when nightmares have left you exhausted and irritable, he approaches with unusual directness. "Father," he says, "I know you're troubled by what you saw in the Holy Land. I don't need to know what it was, but I need you to know that it doesn't change who you are to me." His words, spoken with the straightforward honesty that only children can manage, penetrate defenses that adult sympathy couldn't breach. In that moment, you realize that your attempts to protect your family from the reality of your trauma have actually isolated them from the possibility of helping. William's acceptance isn't contingent on your recovery or your ability to return to your former self. It's based on his love for the person you are now, damaged and struggling though that person might be. This recognition becomes a foundation for different kinds of relationships, built on honesty rather than performance. You begin allowing your family to see more of your authentic struggle, not by burdening them with graphic details, but by acknowledging that your difficulties are real and ongoing. When nightmares wake you, instead of pretending everything is fine, you simply say you had bad dreams. When crowded gatherings become overwhelming, instead of forcing yourself to endure them, you excuse yourself without elaborate explanations. This honesty creates space for your family to adapt realistically, rather than trying to accommodate invisible problems they don't understand. Eleanor's response to your increased transparency reveals the strength that sustained her through your absence and your difficult return. She doesn't try to fix your problems or force healing on any particular timeline. Instead, she adapts your shared life to accommodate your current limitations, while maintaining hope for gradual improvement. When you confess that physical intimacy has become difficult, she responds with patience rather than taking it as personal rejection. When you admit that certain sounds trigger panic responses, she quietly arranges household routines to minimize such triggers, without making you feel like an invalid. The relationship with your brotherhood of fellow veterans evolves beyond mutual commiseration toward practical collaboration. Jeffrey suggests a project that provides purpose without requiring the kind of decisive leadership that has become difficult for you, establishing a small chapel dedicated to prayer for the souls of all who died in the Crusades, Christian and Muslim alike. The project appeals to your guilt about the dead while offering constructive action rather than passive suffering. Working on the chapel becomes a form of therapy, though you have no words for that concept. The physical labor provides an outlet for restless energy. The spiritual purpose helps address moral injuries that purely psychological healing couldn't touch, and the collaboration with other trauma survivors creates community around shared purpose rather than shared suffering. Brother Marcus contributes liturgical expertise. Jeffrey provides construction knowledge, and you offer funding and location. Sir Robert D. Vere, still struggling with his own breakdown, finds meaning in simple manual labor that requires no complex decisions. The chapel project also provides an acceptable narrative for your changed behavior. Instead of being the Lord who returned strange and withdrawn from the Crusades, you become the Lord who built a memorial to honor the dead. The community can understand and respect this response to war experience, giving you social standing that doesn't require pretending to be unchanged. The project allows you to be publicly different from your former self, without being socially diminished. Your faith, shattered by witnessing religious hypocrisy and violence, begins a slow reconstruction along different lines. Instead of the confident certainty that once characterized your belief, you develop a more tentative relationship with the divine that leaves room for doubt and moral complexity. Prayer becomes less about requesting divine favor and more about expressing gratitude for small moments of peace. Scripture reading focuses on passages about suffering and redemption rather than triumph and dominance. This evolving spirituality doesn't restore your previous religious confidence, but it provides a framework for meaning that can accommodate the moral ambiguities you've witnessed. You begin to understand that faith might be compatible with uncertainty, that devotion might coexist with doubt, that service to God might require questioning rather than blind obedience. These insights don't eliminate your spiritual struggles, but they make those struggles feel like legitimate aspects of religious life, rather than signs of failure. The seasonal cycle becomes important to your healing in ways you don't initially recognize. Winter's enforced isolation and introspection provide necessary space for processing difficult memories without social pressure to appear normal. Spring's renewal offers hope that change and growth remain possible even after devastating damage. Summer's long days and increased activity help rebuild confidence in your ability to function in the world. Autumn's preparation for winter teaches lessons about accepting cycles of difficulty and recovery rather than expecting linear progress. Your relationship with Eleanor deepens in unexpected ways as you both learn to build intimacy, ground truth rather than idealization. She stops trying to restore the man who left for the Crusades and begins loving the man who returned, complete with his damage and limitations. You stop trying to protect her from the reality of your struggles and begin trusting her strength to handle honesty. This rebuilt relationship isn't identical to what you shared before the war, but it's more authentic and ultimately more resilient. The children adapt in ways that reveal their own capacity for growth and understanding. William continues his martial training, but with a more realistic appreciation for the costs of violence. Margaret develops unusual emotional sensitivity that allows her to recognize when you're struggling and respond with quiet comfort rather than demands for attention. Both children learn that love doesn't require perfection, that families can include damaged members without being destroyed by that damage. Your role in the community gradually shifts to accommodate your changed capabilities and interests instead of the military leadership that once defined your social position. You become known for different qualities: thoughtful judgment in legal disputes, generous support for charitable causes, patient mentorship for young men struggling with their own difficulties. These new roles don't carry the same prestige as military command, but they provide meaningful ways to contribute to community welfare that don't require capabilities you've lost. The most significant development in your healing is the gradual acceptance that recovery doesn't mean returning to who you were before. The man who left for the Crusades was confident, certain, untroubled by moral complexity. That man is gone, and attempting to resurrect him only creates additional suffering. The man you're becoming is more cautious, more doubtful, more aware of life's ambiguities, but also more compassionate, more honest, appreciative of simple pleasures and peaceful moments. This acceptance doesn't eliminate your trauma symptoms, but it changes your relationship with them. Nightmares become less terrifying when you stop interpreting them as signs of madness or weakness and start understanding them as natural responses to unnatural experiences. Hypervigilance becomes less exhausting when you stop fighting it and start using it constructively. You become known for your ability to notice problems and potential conflicts before others see them, making you valuable in planning and security matters. The wisdom of Scourcier's past 3, then 5, then 7 since your return from the Holy Land. The acute phase of trauma gradually gives way to something resembling normal life. Though normal has been permanently redefined, you've learned to carry your experiences as scars rather than open wounds, marks that remain sensitive but no longer bleed at every touch. This transformation doesn't represent complete healing that may be impossible, but it represents successful adaptation to permanent change. Your chapel project has become a place of pilgrimage for other returning crusaders, men who find in its quiet sanctuary a space for honest reflection about their experiences. Word spreads through informal networks about this place where warriors can pray for enemies, as well as comrades where doubt is accepted alongside faith, where the complexity of religious warfare can be acknowledged rather than simplified into triumphant narratives. The chapel's existence validates experiences that official church doctrine can't accommodate, providing spiritual healing for wounds that formal religious structures can't address. Brother Marcus has become the chapel's unofficial chaplain, offering counsel to visitors who struggle with their own versions of your difficulties. His presence bridges the gap between religious authority and veteran experience, providing theological legitimacy for spiritual struggles that might otherwise be dismissed. as weakness or lack of faith. Through him, you learn that your experiences aren't unique. Similar crises of faith and meaning have touched many who serve in the Crusades, though few have found safe spaces to express their doubts. The Brotherhood of Broken Shields has evolved into something resembling a formal organization, though it maintains its secretive character. Members support each other through ongoing difficulties while also identifying and helping newly returned veterans who show signs of trauma. Jeffrey has become skilled at recognizing the signs of severe adjustment problems and intervening before men like Sir Robert De Vere reach complete breakdown. Your group has prevented several suicides and probably saved multiple marriages from destruction caused by untreated trauma. Your own marriage with Eleanor has found a new equilibrium based on mutual acceptance of change rather than expectation of restoration. She's developed her own interests and responsibilities that don't depend on your emotional availability. You've learned to offer what support you can without feeling guilty about what you can't provide. Your physical intimacy has gradually returned, though it remains different from before, more tentative, more precious because you both understand how easily it could be lost. Children have grown into young adults who understand their father's struggles without being defined by them. William, now 17, has chosen a path that honors your military heritage while acknowledging its costs. Instead of seeking glory in foreign wars, he's focused on defensive strategies and local security, preparing to protect what exists rather than conquest of what doesn't belong to you. His maturity reflects hard-won wisdom about the difference between necessary violence and glorious adventure. Margaret, at 14, has developed exceptional skills in managing people and situations, probably as an adaptation to growing up with a traumatized father. She can diffuse tense situations with remarkable subtlety, recognizes emotional distress in others with unusual accuracy, and provides comfort without being told what's needed. These abilities will serve her well in whatever life she chooses, but they also represent the price children pay when families are shaped by trauma. Your role in regional politics has shifted to reflect your changed perspectives and capabilities. Instead of the aggressive military leadership that once characterized your political involvement, you've become known for careful negotiation and conflict prevention. Other lords consult you about defensive strategies and alliance building, recognizing that your experience has given you unusual insight into the costs of warfare. You've helped prevent several minor conflicts from escalating into destructive campaigns, saving lives and resources that might have been wasted on disputes that negotiation could resolve. The economic management of your estates has reached a new level of effectiveness as you've learned to focus on sustainable practices rather than maximum short-term profit. Your experience of scarcity in the Holy Land has given you perspective on the difference between genuine needs and artificial wants, leading to more efficient resource allocation and better tenant relationships. Your serfs and free farmers benefit from policies designed to ensure long-term stability rather than immediate extraction of maximum rents. Your spiritual life is stabilized around a form of faith that accommodates doubt rather than eliminating it. You attend church services regularly, but you've stopped expecting them to provide answers to questions that may not have answers. Prayer has become less about requesting divine intervention and more about expressing gratitude for what you have while acknowledging what you've lost. This modified faith doesn't provide the confident certainty that once characterized your belief, but it offers sustainable meaning that doesn't collapse. When confronted with life's moral complexities, the nightmares haven't stopped, but they've become less frequent and less devastating. You've learned techniques for managing them, keeping a candle lit so you don't wake in complete darkness, maintaining weapons nearby so your subconscious feels secure, practicing breathing exercises that help distinguish between memory and reality. Eleanor has learned to respond to your nocturnal distress without taking it personally, providing quiet presence until the episodes pass. Your relationship with other veterans continues to evolve. As new men return from ongoing conflicts in the Holy Land and elsewhere, each generation of returning warriors brings similar struggles, but your group's experience allows them to provide more effective support than you received. The informal network has developed protocols for identifying severely traumatized veterans, techniques for gradual integration back into civilian life, and resources for family members trying to understand and support their changed loved ones. You've begun writing not formal chronicles or heroic accounts, but honest reflections on the reality of warfare and its aftermath. These writings aren't intended for publication or public consumption. They're therapeutic exercises that help you process experiences that still resist complete understanding. But Jeffrey has suggested that future generations of returning warriors might benefit from such honest accounts, even if they can't be shared openly during current social conditions. The writing process has revealed how much your understanding of your own experience has evolved over the years. Events that once seemed meaningless or purely destructive have become part of a larger pattern of growth and adaptation. Losses that once felt like permanent damage have become sources of hard-earned wisdom. Relationships that seemed irreparably broken have been rebuilt along different but ultimately stronger foundations. Your perspective on the Crusades themselves has reached a complex equilibrium between condemnation and acceptance. You can't approve of much that was done in God's name, but you stopped torturing yourself with responsibility for decisions that were beyond your control or understanding at the time. You participated in events that caused tremendous suffering, but you've learned to distinguish between collective responsibility for systemic problems and personal guilt for individual choices made under extreme circumstances. The man you become isn't the man you once were, but he's someone you can respect and live with. Confident certainties of youth have been replaced by hard-won wisdom about life's ambiguities. The physical courage that once defined your identity has been supplemented by moral courage, needed to face painful truths about yourself and your society. The social status that once came from military achievement has been replaced by influence, based on character and judgment rather than conquest and dominance. The legacy of understanding is your own healing progresses from acute crisis to chronic management, to something approaching wisdom. You begin to see your role not just as a survivor of trauma, but as a potential guide for others facing similar struggles. The chapel has attracted visitors from across the region, not just returning crusaders, but men struggling with violence, loss, moral injury, and spiritual crisis from many different sources. Your experience has given you insight into forms of suffering that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of religious warfare. A young knight named Sir Thomas seeks your counsel after participating in a punitive expedition against rebellious peasants. The violence wasn't foreign war, but domestic enforcement, yet his symptoms sleeplessness, flashbacks, moral anguish about orders he followed mirror your own post-crusade struggles. Through conversation, you help him understand that the source of trauma matters less than learning to process and integrate difficult experiences. Whether violence occurs in the Holy Land or in local conflicts, whether victims are foreign enemies or domestic subjects, the psychological impact on those who inflict violence can be similar. This recognition expands your understanding of your own experience from something unique to military service abroad to something relevant to various forms of human violence and moral conflict. The skills you've developed for managing trauma, the frameworks you've created for rebuilding meaning after moral injury, the relationships you've formed with others carrying similar burdens. All these have applications beyond the specific context of crusading warfare. Your son William, now approaching his majority, brings you the news that another crusade is being preached. The Holy Land has fallen into Muslim hands again, and the church calls for renewed military effort to reclaim sacred territory. The familiar rhetoric about holy war and divine purpose fills the air, exciting young men who haven't witnessed the reality behind the rhetoric. William asks for your blessing to take the cross and follow in your footsteps. The request forces you to confront the difference between your current wisdom and your former convictions. Part of you wants to protect William from experiencing what you've experienced, but another part recognizes that preventing him from making his own choices will be another form of damage. Your response reflects the complex understanding you've developed about warfare, service, moral responsibility, and individual agency. You tell William about the costs of warfare that heroic narratives don't mention, not to discourage his service, but to ensure his decision is based on complete information rather than romantic fantasy. You describe the moral complexities he'll face, the difficulty of maintaining faith when witnessing religious hypocrisy, the challenge of returning home when war has changed fundamental aspects of his identity. but you also acknowledge the genuine nobility that can exist within military service. The bonds formed between men facing danger together, the satisfaction of protecting others even at personal cost. Most importantly, you offer him what no one offered you, the promise of understanding and support regardless of what he experiences or how it changes him. You explain about the chapel, the brotherhood of veterans, the techniques for managing trauma symptoms, the possibility of rebuilding, meaning after moral injury. You give him permission to struggle with his experiences, rather than pretending they don't affect him. Permission to seek help rather than suffering in isolation. Permission to become someone different rather than trying to remain unchanged. William decides to take the cross, but his decision is informed by realistic understanding rather than naive enthusiasm. His preparation includes not just martial training but psychological preparation for trauma, moral preparation for ethical complexity, and spiritual preparation for faith challenges. He carries with him letters of introduction to veterans in other regions, men who can provide support if he faces difficulties similar to yours. Most importantly, he knows that returning home damaged won't mean returning home dishonored. Eleanor has developed her own form of expertise in supporting trauma survivors, initially through learning to help you but gradually expanding to assist other wives and families dealing with similar challenges. Her knowledge about recognizing trauma symptoms, creating supportive home environments, and maintaining family stability during a loved one's crisis has made her a valuable resource. For other women facing comparable situations, she's become part of an informal network of military families who support each other through difficulties that civilian families can't understand. Your daughter Margaret shows signs of inheriting your evolved empathy and understanding of human suffering. Now 16, she's expressed interest in learning healing arts, not just the herbal medicine and basic surgery that medieval women traditionally practice, but the emotional and spiritual healing that trauma creates need for. Her childhood experience with your recovery has given her insights into the relationship between mental and physical health that most of her contemporaries lack. The chapel has become more than a memorial, it's evolved into an informal center for what later ages might recognize as psychological and spiritual counseling. Brother Marcus has developed techniques for helping warriors process moral injury through modified confession practices that acknowledge the complexity of warfare, rather than simply assigning penance for clear sins. The Brotherhood meetings have become structured support groups that follow predictable patterns for sharing experience and providing mutual aid. Your writing project has expanded from personal therapeutic exercise to systematic documentation of trauma and recovery processes. Though these accounts can't be shared openly due to social constraints, they're preserved for potential future use, and society might be ready for honest discussion of warfare's psychological costs. Jeffrey suggests that copies should be hidden in monastery libraries, preserved against a time when such knowledge might be valued rather than dismissed as weakness. The network of trauma survivors has begun developing protocols for preventing the most severe forms of veteran breakdown, early intervention techniques, family education programs, gradual reintegration strategies, innovations that arise from practical necessity rather than theoretical knowledge. These developments represent medieval society's attempt to address psychological injury despite lacking modern psychological frameworks. Your own understanding has reached a point where you can see your trauma not just as damage to be healed, but as knowledge to be shared. The experiences that once seemed purely destructive have become sources of wisdom about human resilience, moral complexity, and the possibility of meaning after devastating loss. Your suffering has been transformed, not eliminated, but transformed into capacity for understanding and helping others facing similar challenges. The years of struggle have taught you that healing doesn't mean forgetting or pretending difficult experiences didn't happen. Instead, healing means integrating those experiences into a life story that acknowledges damage while maintaining hope for continued growth. Your scars remain sensitive, but they've also become sources of strength, evidence of survival, reminders of lessons learned, foundations for empathy with others who carry similar wounds. As you prepare for whatever years remain, you carry the knowledge that your trauma has been survived, your relationships have been rebuilt, your purpose has been redefined. The man who returned from the Crusades broken and isolated has become someone who helps others navigate similar brokenness toward possible wholeness. Your legacy won't be military conquest or political achievement, it will be the understanding that even the most devastating experiences can be survived and transformed into wisdom that serves future generations. The peace of acceptance and final transformation in your journey comes not through dramatic revelation but through gradual acceptance of what cannot be changed, and quiet appreciation of what has been preserved or newly created. 20 years have passed since your return from the Holy Land to decades of struggle, adaptation, healing, and growth that have brought you to a place of peace you never expected to reach. Your son William has returned from his own crusade, changed as you knew he would be, but better prepared for the challenges of integration. The support systems you helped create have served him well. He seeks help when needed, maintains connections with other veterans, processes his experiences through the chapel and brotherhood rather than suffering in isolation. His trauma is real, but manageable. His faith is complicated but sustainable. His relationships are strained but resilient. Most importantly, his struggle feels shared rather than solitary. William's successful navigation of his own post-war difficulties validates the work you've done over the past 2 decades. The informal network of veteran support, the chapel providing space for honest spiritual reflection, the family understanding of trauma's reality. These innovations have proven their worth by helping the next generation avoid the worst aspects of what you experienced. Your suffering has been transformed into systems that reduce suffering for others. Eleanor enters her 50th year as a woman whose strength has been tested and proven through the most difficult challenges a marriage can face. The relationship you've rebuilt together has become a model for other military families, dealing with trauma's impact on intimate relationships. Her knowledge of how to support a traumatized spouse while maintaining her own identity and interests has helped numerous other women navigate similar difficulties. She's developed a reputation for wisdom that extends far beyond your immediate community. Margaret has established herself as a healer whose understanding encompasses both physical and emotional injuries. Her childhood experience with your recovery gave her insights into trauma that complement her formal training in herbal medicine and surgical techniques. She's become particularly skilled at helping warriors and their families understand the connection between mental distress and physical symptoms, providing care that addresses the whole person rather than isolated problems. The chapel has evolved into a permanent institution supported by donations from throughout the region. Veterans from various conflicts seek it out as a place where their struggles can be acknowledged and addressed rather than dismissed or simplified. Brother Marcus has trained other religious figures and techniques for spiritual counseling that accommodate moral injury and faith challenges. The chapel's influence extends far beyond its physical location through a network of people who found healing there and carry that understanding to their own communities. Your writing has been carefully preserved in multiple monastery libraries, waiting for a time when society might be ready for honest examination. At warfare's psychological costs, some of Jeffrey's contacts among scholarly clerks have expressed interest in your accounts, suggesting that intellectual understanding of trauma might develop gradually. Even if popular culture isn't ready for such discussions, your documentation, both suffering and recovery, provides a resource for future generations dealing with similar challenges. The Brotherhood of Broken Shields has become a self-sustaining organization that identifies, supports, and integrates returning veterans without requiring your direct leadership. Younger members who benefited from the support now provide that support to others, creating continuity that will outlast any individual member. The techniques developed through years of trial and error have been refined into effective protocols for trauma management and family education. Your role in regional politics has stabilized around conflict prevention and diplomatic resolution, rather than military leadership. Reputation for understanding warfare's true costs makes you valuable in negotiations, where others might resort to violence. You've helped prevent numerous conflicts through patient mediation that acknowledges the legitimate interests of all parties while highlighting the probable costs of violent resolution. Your influence serves peace rather than conquest. The economic management of your estates reflects hard-won wisdom about sustainability and human relationships. Your policies balance immediate needs with long-term stability, recognizing that true prosperity requires the welfare of everyone involved rather than maximum extraction from those with less power. Your Your tenants and employees benefit from leadership that understands scarcity's reality, while working to prevent it rather than exploiting it. Your spiritual life has reached an equilibrium that accommodates both faith and doubt, both hope and realism, both individual devotion and community responsibility. You attend religious services as an expression of cultural belonging, rather than desperate seeking for answers. Participate in community prayers as acts of solidarity rather than requests for divine intervention. Your faith has become a tool for meaning-making rather than a source of absolute certainty. About cosmic justice, the nightmares have become rare visitors rather than nightly tormentors. When they do come, you have effective techniques for managing them and returning to sleep. Eleanor knows how to provide comfort without taking your distress personally. The entire household understands that occasional difficult nights are normal aspects of your condition rather than signs of crisis requiring dramatic intervention. Your relationship with memories of the Crusades has evolved from tortured reliving to reflective understanding. You can discuss your experiences honestly without being overwhelmed by emotion. Acknowledge mistakes without being paralyzed by guilt. Honor the dead without being consumed by survivor's remorse. The memories remain vivid, but they've been integrated into a life story that includes growth beyond trauma, rather than being defined entirely by traumatic events. Most significantly, you've learned to see your trauma not as a failure of character or faith, but as a normal human response to abnormal circumstances. The shame that once compounded your suffering has been replaced by understanding. That psychological injury reflects exposure to extreme stress rather than personal weakness. This shift in perspective has allowed you to help others avoid the self-blame that makes trauma recovery more difficult. As you sit in your chapel on a quiet evening, watching candles flicker before memorials to friends who didn't return and enemies who deserve better deaths, you feel something approaching gratitude for the journey that brought you here. Not gratitude for the trauma itself, some experiences are too destructive to celebrate, but gratitude for the growth that became possible once survival was assured. The man you become isn't the man you were before the Crusades, but he's someone you can respect and live with peacefully. Confident certainties of youth have been replaced by hard-won wisdom about life's moral complexities. The physical courage that once defined your identity has been supplemented by emotional courage, needed to face painful truths and continue growing despite them. The social status that once came from military achievement has been replaced by influence based on character, compassion, and understanding rather than conquest and dominance. Your legacy won't be carved in stone monuments or recorded in heroic chronicles. Instead, it lives in the veterans who found support through systems you helped create. Families who navigated trauma with knowledge you helped develop. Conflicts prevented through wisdom you helped accumulate. Your suffering has been transformed into service that will continue long after your own struggles are finished. The bells of evening prayer ring across the countryside, calling the faithful to acknowledge the day's ending and prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring. You join that prayer not with desperate pleading for divine intervention, but with quiet appreciation for what has been preserved, what has been learned, and what has been shared. The peace you found isn't the absence of difficulty, but the presence of meaning that can accommodate difficulty without being destroyed by it. As darkness settles over the land, you return to your chamber where Eleanor waits with the patient love that has sustained both of you through the hardest years either of you could have imagined. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new occasions for the wisdom that emerges only from surviving what seems unsurvivable. But tonight, there is peace, not the perfect peace of innocence lost forever, but the deeper peace of experience transformed into understanding, suffering transformed into service, trauma transformed into resilience that can be shared with others who walk similar paths. The dark night's hidden wounds have become sources of light for others walking through their own darkness. In the end, perhaps that transformation is the closest thing to victory that survivors of trauma can hope to achieve.